a leader who has influenced you in a positive direction? What motivated you to follow his or her lead? Was it more by their words, what they say, or by their actions, what they did? In most cases, you might have been influenced by the example that a leader sets, what had the most impact on you. A wise poet once said, "And the best of all the preachers are the men who live their creeds, for to see a good put in actions is what everybody needs." Words are important, but only if they are backed up by actions. The essence of leadership that makes a difference is influence. And this led me to think about people we consider great, but they were just normal people in their time, like Mohandas Gandhi, Martin Luther King Jr., and Mother Teresa. These people lived out their message. And that was what gave them a spiritual authority and great influence over people. Effective leaders embody their message. Like Gandhi said, "My life is my message." Gandhi was a man who was never an official leader, never held any political office, never held any official title at all, and yet one who in so many ways had transformed the history of his people. He brought needed change to his world, and not through political manipulation or institutional power, but rather through the real power of a life that embodied his values. That's why Gandhi still influences the world today, because of his remarkable example of leadership based on moral authority, or what we will refer to as spiritual authority. That remarkable influence of the embodiment of great ideas is opposed to the power that comes only from some external and structural authority. Gandhi, Martin Luther King Jr., and Mother Teresa all had moral authority, which is in contrast with current political leaders, that they exercise their power, but they do not lead by a moral example. Leadership is influencing people to move towards common objectives. And the most influential leaders do this by appealing to common values and calling. And people will follow such leaders, even when there is no the promise of any material incentives. It is based on a spiritual power. It is a non-coercive power that influences people through real spiritual energy. Sometimes we think that people are motivated by concrete incentives, like power, titles, status, money. But we forget that people are also inspired by exemplary role models. And we can make the case that Christian leadership is rooted here by exemplary role models. And yesterday, when Rita was introducing Linus, and the way she was telling us about how he had impacted her life in a positive direction, I couldn't help but think about Linus as an exemplary role model. Christian leadership is authentic only to the degree that it reflects this type of a spiritual authority and power that comes from following Jesus. When my family and I were living in China, I had the privilege to to be discipled by a wonderful Malaysian woman who had a great influence on me. She was a lady after God's heart. She couldn't help but talk about Jesus. She was anointed, and she walked her talk. There were two aspects that made me follow her. The first one was her integrity, as she was the same person at church, at home, and even when nobody was looking at her. And her authenticity, as what I saw is what I got. She was trustworthy, she was real, and not manipulative. And as a result, she had a great influence over me, and a spiritual authority over me, and many more. And because I saw her living out her message, it gave her that certain authority that you cannot buy anywhere, at any rate, other than by living well. She was rock solid on what she valued, and she lived out those values. Even in her last day on earth, battling cancer, she never stopped walking her talk. During the last chemos, she didn't want to stay at the hospital, and one of her doctors took her home to live with her family. And in one of her last emails, she wrote to me with the same energy and eagerness to be a witness for Christ as she always had. I will read a portion of her email. The Lord is so very faithful, Karen. I now know a greater degree of His loving kindness, His mercy, and His faith. I could not have stayed with a more kind, gracious, and hospitable host than Dr. Basanta. I am so thankful for everything. Only God could have planned it all. We were so free. We could pray for her friends to be baptized with the Holy Spirit, and they were. One of her patients visited. I led him to the Lord. Groups came for prayer. I was asked to teach them. I did. The house became a house of prayer, a house of joy and peace. I'm so happy here. When it is time to leave, it will be difficult. But I have learned God is my helper. I can and must do all things in and through Him. He is a victorious God. He is the Lord. There is no one like Him. Rani Sebastian. It was her life that influenced me as much as her words. Without the life I saw, her words would not have had the same impact. Because her life backed up her words, I was willing to listen. And then I wanted to follow her because I saw that she was following after Christ. That's why the Apostle Paul could say, "Follow me as I follow after Christ." He showed people how to live, as well as telling or teaching them how to live. When we realize we are going to have an influence on people, whether we really even want to or not, there is this simple concept and yet a profound sense of owning your influence. When effective leaders realize this, they reflect on how can they most effectively use that influence to move people in a godly direction. In a direction that is God honoring. That is towards the goals and objectives that He would have. That is for a greater purpose and not for self-interest. Someone that pursues power and self-interest carries around the human consequence of his decisions. Do I value status and ownership, or do I value community and sacrifice? Whatever I value most, it will show up in my actions. That is why effective leaders model the way. They are clear about what they value, and they live out those values, even when they are not in leadership roles, in leadership positions. When you think in the biblical example of Joseph and the way God prepared him and equipped him to be a leader, it was from the time he was a teenager until he was in his early 30s. And he was a slave, and he was in prison. And you will think, what did Joseph do that made God so upset with him? And you will think he's not a very effective leader. And yet, in the midst of what he went through, he showed effective leadership. He used his influence for good wherever he was. And then in the end, God affirmed him as he placed him in a leadership role that had impacted many people, including his own family. Of course, the ultimate example of leadership is Jesus. In the life and ministry of Jesus, we find that he too had not official title or office. He had not accredited learning, led no armies, opposed the use of violence, and taught us rather about the transforming spiritual power of love and forgiveness. And yet he changed the world forever. And in the greatest act of spiritual influence in the history of the world, he sacrificially gave himself for the redemption of the world. And Jesus is fully aware of this power of that sacrificial act when he says in John 12:32, when I am lifted up from the earth, I will draw all people to myself. You see, it is the power of his teaching and the sheer quality of his life that changed the world forever. He is the source of true, authentic leadership. To conclude my talk, if we make the case that the essence of leadership that makes a difference is influence, how can you most effectively use your influence to move people in a godly direction? So my call to action involves an exercise called the mirror and the window. Ineffective leaders look in the mirror when things are going well and congratulate themselves. And they look out of the window when things are not going well to find other people to blame. And we understand the biblical principle that we're supposed to humble ourselves before God, leading with humility and with a servant attitude. And one way you do that is when things are going well, you look out of the window and find other people to give credit to. And when things are not going well, you look in the mirror and say, how did I contribute to this difficulty? So during the next few minutes, I invite you to look out of the window and give credit to the leaders who had influenced you in a positive direction. And write down specific things about their actions that had the most influence on you. Thank you.